start by introducing myself. Again, my name is Willie Baptist, like a Baptist church. I'm formerly homeless, and I've been poor nearly all my life. I've worked all kinds of jobs. I've had all kinds of experience in terms of social struggles and organizing and dealing with the issues that are besetting our nation, especially the issue of poverty in the midst of plenty, abandonment in the midst of abundance. And I want to talk about that tonight in terms of the implications it has for you as students and you as community leaders, union organizers, and so forth. I was a member of the United Steelworkers Union, and I was a shop steward and union organizer. And then I became a leader and union organizer of the National Union of the Homeless. So I went from, working to being homeless. And so I've had the opportunity to learn to organize and to do the things that need to be done in terms of trying to pull people together to speak out for their rights, and to come together in a way that would give us more strength and a bigger voice in terms of the issues that we're confronted with. And these issues are increasing every day in terms of the daily infliction of social injustice and violence that's happening here in this country. Poverty being one of the worst forms of violence. I want to tell you one of the experience, just to start the thing off, that I had a while back, and just give you an idea of the kind of experience I've gone through that have shaped me and has really molded me into who I am today. I used to be very active in Kensington, Philadelphia, which is the poorest community in the entire state of Pennsylvania. And I've since moved on in terms of other areas of work, but still work very closely with that organization. And we developed a reputation of moving mothers and their babies who are out in the cold into HUD housing, or so-called low-income housing. Our philosophy was that we wouldn't allow a family to exist in that kind of situation for seconds, if indeed there's empty houses that are sitting out there that are supposed to be allocated for low-income families, that in the dead, cold winter, we were not going to stand by and allow mothers and their babies to stand out there. So we would move families in by all kinds of means. We go through legitimate means and means that are not so legitimate. In that activity over the years, we developed a kind of reputation of having to bring attention to the issues that we are confronted with, like the issues of homelessness or job layoff, you name it. And people have gotten word of that and has asked us to come in to share experiences. So I was asked to go into Austin, Texas. Anybody here from Austin, Texas?
Actually,
You are?
yeah.
Okay, then I have to tell this story straight up then. Anyway, we had a situation in Austin, Texas. This is about several years ago. Well, I should say it was at least a decade ago, where you had no policies directed toward dealing with people who are laid off from their jobs, and they go through a period of having to exhaust their unemployment benefit, and then they can't pay rent, and they become homeless. And so homelessness grew by leaps and bounds in the city of Austin to the fact that, to the point where you go downtown, you can see in parking lots and in the alleyways, families with their kids and their babies living in structures no larger than dog houses. I mean, this is just the whole, there was a time in Austin where you can go down there and you've seen homelessness all over the place. And so the brothers and sisters asked us to come in to talk in terms of how do you move this issue, how do you unite this population and help break their isolation. Of course, you had homeless people of all race and colors, all genders, and they had all the different types of things that kept them apart, the racism, the racial mistrust, all the kinds of stuff that kept them apart that prohibited them from having any kind of impact by way of some kind of unity. So they was asking us, how do we do it in Kensington? Because Kensington is basically 1/3 poor white, 1/3 poor black, 1/3 poor Latino, and we had to deal with this problem of how do you bring people together to deal with those issues that we had in common, and then deal with these racial fears and antagonism in the context of what we had in common. And so people had seen that and was wondering how we could do that with regard to Austin, Texas, and the situation that was faced there. So we went there. So we exchanged our experiences, and then afterwards they came up with a plan. And the plan was to divide up into different outreach groups to do research on what was the issues and problems besetting the city, and that the city did not have any allocation for families who became homeless as a result of social and economic dislocations. And so one group, we spanned out, and groups went different places to look into these issues, to investigate these issues. And one of the groups went to the city council. The city council, they was able to apprehend the budget for that year. They looked at every item of the budget, looked at every item, and they saw indeed that there was no consideration for people who are laid off and are evicted and what have you, and thus, a major source of homelessness. So based on that information and other information, we decided on an action. I should say this first, is that in downtown Austin, there was this item that they had put aside for to help the downtown Austin area to serenade the yuppies and the buppies, the people who worked in the downtown area. And one of the allocations was $800 to purchase a goose. The geese that y'all see coming around here, they have to pay for those things. And on the budget, there was an allocation of $800 per goose. Nothing for human beings. People have been set out, and so they brought that information back to our group. We looked at all the other stuff and decided on the action. Well, every city has a historic district. I guess Ithaca has a historic district somewhere. Well, Austin had one of these kinds of places down in the downtown area. And it's basically, they had mansions, that important people at some point had lived in. And that was the historic district. So based on that information and other information, decided on the action. The action was to move homeless people out of the vacant lot into one of the mansions. And then call the police and the media to let them know what's going on so we can bring some attention to this issue and bring some focus on this issue. So as soon as they got word of it, here come the police cars, the sirens, the news trucks coming into the area of the historic district. They go to the place where we had moved into the mansion, and they jumped out of the car with their guns out, and the cameras rolling. Huh? They go to the door, knock on the door, and nothing happens until a few seconds. Then you hear the squeaking of the door as it opens. And when they opened the door, there was a homeless brother and a homeless sister holding one of the goose with a knife at the neck. They said, you take any step further, this goose is cooked. They had kidnapped one of the goose. And they had the media, and they had the attention of public opinion for 2 weeks, talking about why would they put priorities on anything other than human beings and babies and families and so forth and so on. I give you that experience because I know that in this period when all of us are beginning to feel increasing economic insecurity, where we have increasingly things that we have in common with regard to these life and death issues of homelessness, housing, and healthcare, and so on, that questions of race and questions of division potentially comes up, and it's important that we understand the relationship between the racial inequality and the economic questions. And these are the questions that Martin Luther King was grappling with when he was building the Poor People's Campaign 40 years ago. What I want to do right now is to stop at this point and show a clip of a video on the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. And we want to discuss what was that campaign all about, and what is the lesson it holds for us today?
The last ferocious debate within King's inner circle was over whether to try to build a whole movement out of the Riverside speech against the war, or do the Poor People's Campaign.
If Dr. King, is serious in what he's projecting, it would seem to me that he has to be able to rally these forces to really have what you call a united black movement around the country. To include those guys who are willing to die by shooting at the cat on the rooftop.
I know nonviolence will work. I know it will work. It works in personal relationships. It works in marriage. It works with children. And it works with Bull Corners. And it works with Jim Clark. And it can work in Washington.
The Poor People's Campaign ultimately won Dr. King's allegiance because even though he didn't expect it to be embraced at the time, it was the right call. It was the next headlight. It was saying, we have people in this country who, no matter what laws are passed, are still going to be so damaged and so excluded and so invisible that the richest country in the world needs to take special steps.
Our plan was to mobilize people in about 15 different poverty areas. We had poor whites, we had Native Americans, we had Hispanic, we had rural blacks, urban blacks. It was sort of decided that this was not something we could win. But we remembered that the bonus marches in the Depression didn't win either. They actually got run out of Washington by General MacArthur. But their being there set the stage for the New Deal.
The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. Now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power.
We were on the road for the Poor People's Campaign. And in the middle of this, the Memphis garbage workers went on strike.
Public employees cannot strike against their employer. And this you can't do. I suggested to these men that you go back to work.
This thing started with two garbage men who were crushed in the back of a garbage truck, along with the garbage, because they were not allowed to seek shelter in white neighborhoods in Memphis.
When a public official orders a group of men to get back to work, then we'll talk, and treats them as though they are not men, that's a racist point of view. And no matter how you dress it up in terms of whether or not a union can organize, it's still racism. For at the heart of racism is the idea that a man is not a man.
All labor has dignity. But you're doing another thing. You are reminding not only Memphis, but you are reminding the nation that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wage.
He got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to catch a 6 o'clock plane to Memphis and was planning to be back in Washington that evening for a meeting. And he said, well, you go on to Washington. So I went on to Washington, and he and Bernard Lee went to Memphis. He planned to just start the march and then go get on the plane, but as soon as the march started, people started breaking windows and throwing bricks and bottles.
Dr. King felt very strongly he didn't want to be a part of anything that was disrupted with that kind of violence, because it appeared that people who were in the march had thrown bricks and disrupted the march.
It was obviously a planned disruption. In fact, there were some of the young people that told us that they were paid to start trouble.
Martin Luther King fled the scene. He took to his heels and disappeared, leaving it to others to cope with the destructive forces he had helped to unleash. And I hope that well-meaning Negro leaders and individuals in the Negro community in Washington will now take a new look at this man who gets other people into trouble and then takes off like a scared rabbit.
My only reaction is that I did not abandon the march when the going got rough. I have always said that I will not lead a violent demonstration.
And he follows all of us to Atlanta. We didn't know what to think, because that never had happened in any march that we participated in.
Dr. King's determination was that we're going to go back to Memphis. We're going to do it right. We're not going to allow provocateurs to destroy our movement. And then we're going to Washington.
All of us went back with him. And we did meet with the young men, and we did meet with the preachers, and we did try to help the community to understand that it was possible.
There was, as always, a mass meeting going on where the garbage workers had gathered, and massive numbers of people from the city had gathered, and the church was crowded because, well, they knew Dr. King was coming back to town.
But when we got to the church and saw so many people there, we called him and went back and made him get dressed and say, you just have to come on and say a word to these people.
We have an injunction, and we're going into court tomorrow morning to fight this illegal, unconstitutional injunction. All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper.
The eyes were tired. I'll stop short of saying defeated. So he was smoking, and he looked something short of disheveled. Looking at him, there's a sense of being alone. Not, or at least being uncertain as to who your allies are.
We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
exhausted. He had a slight fever. He didn't want to go. But once he said it all, he was feeling good, and he was sort of on a high the next day. We had to go into federal court to get an injunction overturned. And I spent most of the time testifying in the court. When I came back to the hotel, Martin was in his brother's room. When I came in the room, he said, "Where have you been?" And he threw a pill at me. And I was trying to tell him, that I'd been in court all day. And he said, "Don't you know you can't stay in court? You're supposed to report to me. You're supposed to let me know what's going on. I've been worried all day long." And he kept throwing pillows at us, so I started throwing them back at him. And the next thing you know, they had all jumped on me and put me down between these two beds and piled the pillows on top of me. And it was, it was just childish play. And somebody came and knocked on the door and said, "They're here to pick you up for dinner." And he said, "Well, let me go up." And he went upstairs to his room to dress. And we were standing out in the courtyard. I was telling him, "It's getting cold, and you've had a cold. You need to bring your top coat." And he was, wondering whether he really wanted to bring a coat. The next thing you know, I thought a firecracker had gone off or something. Until I looked up there and I saw that he wasn't there, and I thought he was clowning, because he'd been so playful and happy and clowning.
The assassination of Martin Luther King, the Poor People's Campaign went forward, but it went forward considerably weakened, given the kind of leadership that he would have been able to exert within that campaign, particularly with the task that they had took on. And that was to take the civil rights movement further into a poor people's campaign that would unite poor folks across color lines, no matter where they were in the country, and to bring attention to the problems of poverty to the nation in the richest country in the world. Now, when I got involved with social activity, I was not a Martin Luther King man. I was a Malcolm X man. That's what I was. I didn't trust any white folks, y'all. I didn't like white folks. I was so busy trying to be proud of myself as being a black person. I'm black and I'm black and I'm proud. That was my slogan. And that means I didn't like how I translated that. I don't trust white folks. Now, I had such hatred for white folks, or distrust, let me put it that way, that I only wore black underwear. I didn't wear white underwear. And so Martin Luther King talking all this integration talk, he was not the guy that I listened to and learned from. It's only been in the last 5 years that I began to read his writings, his sermons, and to begin to appreciate not only his brilliance, but his bravery. If you heard his speech, he knew he was going to get killed, and yet he still was determined to go forward in this process, because his concern for human beings and concern for humanity and bettering this country and making it a better nation. Now, I'm saying this because this shaped my life, and he's shaped, since I've come to know him more and read his writings, it shaped me in terms of what commitment is all about. Now, I think we got to learn some lessons about that. Instead of having one Martin Luther King, every one of us has got to be Martin Luther Kings. You hear what I'm saying? And we have to develop an appreciation and a sophistication to make the kinds of analysis that tells us what do we need to do at these times. The problems of poverty in the 60s has become worse in this century. In Kensington, North Philadelphia, where my organization, the Kensington Worker Rights Union, is based, this is the poor, like I mentioned earlier, is the poorest community in the entire state of Pennsylvania. It has only two major sources of income in Kensington. One is welfare, public welfare, which is being cut. And the other one is monies that come from the drug trade, the drug industry. Two sources. Then it has the rest of the income come from what we call SLJs. You know what SLJs is? Shitty little jobs. You got to work 2 or 3 of them in order to make ends meet. This is the circumstances that define this community, but it's proliferating. Their Kensingtons are developing all over the country and in all the different states. This problem of poverty that Martin Luther King took up in the Poor People's Campaign some 40 years ago is with us with a vengeance. It's getting worse. So it behooves us to look at this historical experience to see what was it about this experience that has lessons that we can use in the struggle today. The history of any social movement or any kind of effort to organize has been a history of social change based on uniting and organizing those forces, those social forces that has the least stake in the status quo. Y'all hear what I'm saying? Like, for example, the struggle for women's suffrage at the turn of the last century. What would happen if that movement for women's suffrage was led by men? I don't think anything would happen. Or the struggle against slavery. If the slaves and former slaves and others who were affected by slave power, if they were not in some level of organization, that struggle wouldn't have been brought to any kind of completion. You can go in any period in American history as well as world history and find that that's the leading social force of any change or that section of the population that has the least stake in that system. Martin Luther King pointed out in the last years of his death, he says there are millions of poor folks who are working poverty-wage jobs of every color, I'm paraphrasing, that has little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they would do so with a power and a freedom that will be a new and unsettling force in our national complacent life. That every social process begin with those who are most hurting by the status quo. Martin Luther King understood this, and that's why he began to take up this issue coming out of the civil rights movement. And part of his threat was that historically this country has been able to contain change or prevent change by keeping the bottom disunited. One of the things that W. Du Bois pointed out, that in the slave situation of the Caribbeans and South America, there was massive slave uprisings, including Haiti, where you had an actual slave revolution with Toussaint Louverture. Why is that in that area you had that kind of activity, and yet in the southern areas you had rebellion, but it was on a much smaller scale, and for the most part, rebellion took the form of slaves running away in terms of the Underground Railroad. That was the resistance for the most part. But W. Du Bois, his analysis pointed out in Black Reconstruction that the reason why you had that kind of discrepancy, among others, was that in the South, you had some 4 million black slaves in about 1860. At about that same time, you also had 5 million poor whites. That the reason why you didn't have the kind of uprising was that this plantation politics that we still live by today, y'all, was manipulated so that they can use the oppression and exploitation of the black slaves to accumulate wealth to control the poor whites, and then they can use the poor whites as overseers and slave drivers and slave patrol to control the poor blacks. So they had, or black slaves. So they had this kind of dichotomy that they played off throughout the history of this country. And what Martin Luther King was trying to do was to try to counter that strategy or that formula of power with regards to the crucial question of poverty and wealth relationship within this country. Begin to make inroads. In the history of this country, every time you bring the bottom together, it is smashed. Martin Luther King was assassinated. The United Sharecroppers Union in 1935 that brought ex-Klansmen and ex-Montgomeryites into a relationship. It was a threat. They smashed it. That's the history. I'm just telling you, guys got to read your own history. Every time something like that begins to happen, it brings a threat to the status quo. And then forces are thrown into motion that tries to preempt the process or destroy it. And what happened as a result of Martin Luther King assassination, which was understood that the poor people's movement was not as strong, it weakened. As a result of him not being around and not having other leaders who was really united with the whole notion of fighting poverty by first uniting the poor. Martin Luther King and SCLC was in a minority. You saw the kind of struggle that was going on inside the SCLC. If you read that period, you can see that Martin Luther King was in the minority on this issue. Because of his influence and his persuasion, he saw that this issue was right and this is something that had to be taken up. And he brought the other people along with that whole process. But because of that situation, his assassination, his removal from the scene, crippled that process. And I'm just pointing this out because there is something about that experience that says that if you're going to move that section of the population that's most affected by the problem to move the problem or to solve the problem, you got to unite them. That effort to unite is so important that those forces that are threatened by it have to move on that. But it means that we have to learn the lessons. If we're really about how do we elevate this country, how do we make it better, how do we resolve these problems, that we have to be about learning those lessons so we don't have to suffer the same consequences. People hear what I'm getting at? The critical question of the unity of the slaves or the unity of those who are affected, being evicted or victims of the housing crisis or the healthcare crisis as well that's developing in this country, the key to their unity is this first step in any social movement, and that is the identification and development of leaders. Now the question is, what is a leader? Looking at Martin Luther King, what is a leader? Is a leader someone like me, good looking? Somebody can really talk, say the right words at the right time? Here's a leader. Now I want you guys to indulge me with your imagination. We all are going on a camping trip. Okay? And you see us all there, all of us? We kind of all go together, right? And we're in this forest. And it is dark. And you can hear lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. So we finally find a place where we can we can set up the encampment and go to sleep. We all go to sleep. And then what happens upon our encampment is a grizzly bear. Now this grizzly bear got blood coming out of it. I mean, he's hungry. He smells some meat. And guess who's the meat? Us. Okay, he creeps up on us. Now, the first one to wake up is the leader. Huh? Why? Because that person is in a position to describe the problem and suggest a solution. Get up, go that way, not that way. A leader is someone, not so much that they're good looking, although that can help, and not that they can have great articulation, although that can help. A leader is someone who can identify a problem and put forth a solution to that problem. Y'all hear me? You got a solution to my problem, you are my leader. So developing leaders is a process in which we use everything we do, all the struggles that we're involved in, the hotel worker struggles, or the struggle around homelessness, the struggle around women equality, all these struggles to identify what we call, painting for gold. Identify leaders, people who are prepared to make the commitment to develop themselves as leaders and to make the commitment to developing a movement. Every organizing attempt that doesn't start with identifying those leaders and consolidating those leaders are skipping stages that makes the organizing process, a defeat before you get started. And this is a very important thing because these are stages of development of the social movement. The foundation stage is the stage of developing leaders. And understanding social movements in terms of stages is very important, because understanding that you got to start with the foundation before you get to the roof. The foundation of social movement is leaders and people like yourself who are beginning to wake up to the problems and are in a position to make commitments in terms of building on this question. Now, this is a very difficult thing for us in terms of understanding Americans with our culture, our impatient culture, to understand things in terms of stages. I mean, we want to start at the end of the process before the beginning. We want to build a roof before we build the foundation. But everything has got to start with that initial stage. So the day everything we do, I don't care how big the struggle, how little the struggle, is about who stepped forward in that process that can be developed as leaders within that process, that can awaken to what the contradictions are and to understand those contradictions in terms of how they manifest themselves and what, therefore, you need to do in terms of some kind of solution. This is a very important lesson, because if you compare the history of the Civil Rights Movement with the short history of the Poor People's Campaign, you can see that when the Civil Rights Movement started, what was so significant about its beginning stages is that it was able to constitute leadership. When people hear about the Montgomery boycott, which was very successful in Montgomery, Alabama, they look at, quite rightly so, they look at Rosa Parks, they look at all the activity that took place and the actual victory that was attained, and people noted this victory throughout the country. It got, nationwide coverage. But what is not really grasped and need to be grasped in terms of the key lessons of history, what was most important about that struggle was that they constituted some strategic approach to the problems of civil rights, or the problems of segregation. The combining of litigation with mass activity, nonviolent activity, was a strategic approach that they used throughout the rest of that struggle. But most importantly, they were able to have that strategic approach organized in terms of leadership, which became the Southern Leadership Conference, that Martin Luther King formed that organization. Their ability to form a leadership base set the stage for developing a mass Southern civil rights movement that was able to get civil rights legislation into motion and the problems of Jim Crow, the juror Jim Crow, resolved. For the Poor People's Campaign, they were unable to constitute that leadership. In fact, like I said earlier, Martin Luther King was one of the few leaders that really understood the importance of that march and had the kind of influence and leadership development that posed a situation whereby if he could be moved out of the way, they can postpone that struggle. And that's what happened. And so the lesson for us today is, how do we use our activities, both studying, practical activities, all educational activity, everything we do that constitute a leadership that can understand what the problems are today and how we go about solving it. People hear me? I really want to put that out there, because this is something we have to deal with. And it's in such our impatience, we've got this kind of remote control mentality. We want to fast forward things to the end, and we get very, very impatient about our organizing, and we do not focus the kind of energy and resources on identifying the people who step forward and giving them the time and effort in terms of their development as leaders. Crucial lesson from that Poor People's Campaign. I'll just leave with this last story, and then we'll get into a kind of a question and answer. When I was part of the organizing of the Union of Homeless, which at our height, we was able to establish 25 chapters, union chapters of the homeless union around the country in 26 states. And I think when history is written, they're going to say, that was a very significant development with regard to homelessness in this country, and homeless people actually organizing themselves. That was the homeless union organizing. And out of that struggle came leadership. People you see today, Liz and Phil, myself, many of us came out of that effort during the late 80s and early 90s. And part of the leadership development process was a process of collectivity, of bringing people together to deal with a particular situation and them developing some creative tactic by them coming together that would move the issue. And one of the main issues and main question and problem that we face is the lack of media coverage, or the kind of media coverage that would explain our issue. And we would die because our struggle was obscured or blacked out by the media. And so the nature of activities necessarily had to be dramatic to get people's attention, so then we can discuss the issue. That's what we learned through our struggle. And so we had this one issue that affected most homeless people in Philadelphia, where the shelter system did not have showers. And there was no outlet anywhere in the city for homeless people to get showers. Now, if you're homeless, the worst position to be in, the most inhumane or disrespectful, or just the worst position you can be in and feel like you ain't nothing, is to go to work, and despite what the media says, 50% of homeless people work. They just don't make enough money to pay for their rent. And then you got a good number of them looking for jobs. And to not have the kind of hygiene is the worst feeling you can ever have. Dehumanizing experience. So we got together to deal with this problem. And we get people's heads together, a lot of creativity comes, especially in a circumstance like that. So this is Philadelphia, right? No showers nowhere. But downtown, anybody been to Philadelphia? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you go to Philadelphia, downtown they got a park called Love Park. And they have a fountain that's cascade water. And sometimes they put color in it, it'd be red or blue and what have you. Well, we came up with a plan to bring attention to the problems of not having showers. Now, after we had our meeting, can you imagine 150, 200 homeless people with towels walking in the direction of Love Park? We get up to the fountain, and we start unrobing downtown, where they are gentrifying. They want all the tourists. Here's these homeless people getting naked with their towels. And to make a long story short, media got word of it, everybody got word of it, and we got our showers. Out of that struggle, we was able to go forward in terms of connection with the religious community, connection with the student community, build our relationships, and use some of those kinds of experience to replicate in other areas, and we built the Homeless Union. And out of that experience came the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. Many of the lessons that we've used. The Poor People's Human Rights Campaign consists of over 100 organizations for and homeless people, including the Workers' Center here in Ithaca, is part of that whole process.
You talked a little bit about leaders being sort of the first people to wake up when that bear comes.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that sometimes, you also said though that movements should be led by the people most affected.
Yeah.
But I think that sometimes students are in this weird role where they have the freedom to do some study by themselves and understand some of the roles that are going on, but they might not be the most effective. I'm wondering if you could talk about where they fit into leading movements and also working with them.
This is one of the things I have, main criticism I have of the university and education system of this country, where we might be taught to learn a particular narrow area or a discipline, like we learn to be a biologist or be a doctor, but we're not taught history, or we have no depth in terms of the economy, and it seems to be such an impossible thing to understand because there's no discussion of it, and these things have a bearing on what happened in this country. I mean, how resources are produced and how they're distributed is critical to understanding how do you influence those factors that has a direct bearing on our living standards. So the developing the intellectual aspect of a movement is absolutely critical. I mean, we're not going to get what we need by going to the powers that be with our hat in hand and say, please, will you give us this? Feel sorry for us. Pity us. They don't do that, man. They are about power, and power is about people organizing and uniting people, and we got to do that. But to do that, you've got to start off with leadership development, which is largely an intellectual process. It involves activity, but it's activity that's evaluated, and there's studies of history to learn from history, and you develop leaders. Students who are part of the intelligentsia plays a very important role, not as in quotes, just supporters. They play a role in making leadership commitment. If you come into this movement, I would rather you be a leader than just to be a person that's going to support me. Because a leader is someone who is committed, and competent, and clear as to what we what we need to have. And given the forces that we're up against, we've got to have that sophistication. Now, you've got to have leaders from the ranks of the poor in terms of their training. That's central to the process. But to do that, everybody's got to, that are prepared, has to develop into that kind of leadership. It's just all of history shows that the intelligentsia, particularly students, have played a critical role, especially youth. They played a critical role in terms of success of any social movement. You look at the successful social movements in any country, you'll see that the role of students was critical. Now, understanding what that role is, how do you develop your skills, how do you help transfer some of the skills to other brothers and sisters that are in the struggle, becomes crucial in the process. And so I see that the problem of leadership development is twofold. One is, what social force in the solution to a problem need to be at the forefront? Their demands, their needs have to be in the forefront. That's one problem of leadership as a social group. Now, every poor person, for example, if you're dealing with poverty, or every woman in the struggle for women's suffrage, are not necessarily individual leaders. But as a group, their interests and their needs and their organization has to be at the forefront. That's what history says. But in pulling those forces together, you have leaders that are developed from their ranks, but you have leaders of other ranks, because you've got to have people who are influencing students, influencing religious leaders. You've got to have leaders doing it. So you have these two problems of individual leaders that has to be trained, and social leaders that comes as a result of uniting that force. Those leaders, those individual leaders that are trained, play a very important role in terms of organizing and uniting those forces. So you have these two problems. And you can see someone like Martin Luther King. He was from the middle class. But he's the one that put into motion the Poor People's Campaign. And he's the one that exhibits the kind of qualities that we need to replicate in leadership development among the poor, as well as others who are going to be, who see that this is something that needs to be done. It's right and it's just. So I want to make the first demand is that each one of you use your studies. Use the educational discipline and the research skills and all the different skills you're getting in the college campuses. Use that to apply that to this process and to help transfer some of those skills to this movement as part of this first task, and that is identifying leaders and helping leadership development. There's all kinds of other specific roles, but I would say that that's the main thing. Take that education that you have as a student and begin to translate that into a scholarship of leadership. You know what I'm saying? That's what, I mean, we're trying to win, we ain't trying to lose. And you look in history, you would never find, you go to your school tomorrow, every one of y'all, go to the library, go to the history department of the library. Take any of those books, and I guarantee you, you'll never find on any page where a dumb force rose up and defeated a smart force. Never. Even the barbarians in the Roman Empire, they learned from the Romans and kicked the Romans' ass. Alaric, when he sacked Rome, he was a general in the Roman army. He learned their strategies and their tactics, and they had advanced horseman tactics anyway over the Romans, and they kicked ass. There's never a time in history where people that don't know nothing actually accomplish something. And so that's a critical thing, and I think students and intellectuals have a role to play in help us generate that kind of intellectualism. You hear what I'm saying? There are other questions.
How do you feel that someone like me wants to be able to dedicate themselves to these kind of issues or help unite? Can you repeat the question?
The question was, how do you, she noticed that people of color, correct me if I'm wrong, people of color, there's a lot of fraction that exists, fragmentation, and that how do you begin to resolve that problem? Is that correct?
Right.
Our experience, we don't want to in any way hint that it's the Bible, but it's just our experience, is that again, it comes to this question of bringing, uniting leaders, people who understand that you've got to not play into that game, in terms of allowing yourself to be divided on these critical issues. And in the course of struggles, people do emerge from that struggle who understand that. I remember when I was in a camp, we had Kinston Reparation, and we would from time to time set up tent cities. I remember a discussion that we had, like I said, I was part of the education director. And I would hold these meetings after every day so we can sum up the day and learn from how we act and who did wrong and what and that kind of stuff. And I remember there was this white unemployed worker who was there in the camp. So we went around, everybody's, saying what was on their mind, what was bothering them. And he said, well, look, I've been trying to get these other brothers that have been laid off with me to come on down here so they can get some kind of food, because we had a whole donation system. We was kicking it, as best we can with what we had. And so he said, I'm trying to get them to come down here to learn that they can work with everybody, because you had everybody, every color, every race that was there. So he says, what I've come to learn is that I don't have to fear African Americans. I got to respect them in terms of what they're going through and what they've been through. This is what he's saying. He said, I don't know what it's like to be African Americans, but somehow I'm trying to relate this to my other brothers and sisters who happen to be white that are afraid to come down here, although they need to be down there because they ain't got nothing either. So after he said what he had to say, we went around the circles and got to this black homeless guy. He said, I want to address my comments to the brother that spoke on this question of African Americans. He says, I just want to say this. He says, you don't know what it's like to be African American. And I don't know what it's like, I sure don't know what it's like to be white. He said, but we both know what it's like to be hungry. Let's start there. Now, there's other experiences, I'm sure, but we need to gather those experiences and make it available to each and every one of us, because it behooves us to develop the kind of critical mass that's going to move these crucial issues of life and death. Thanks for listening. Thanks for